Unless we discover problems after mission data review, SpaceX will attempt to catch the ship with the tower on next flight. Not long after Starship's upper stage touched down in the ocean, Elon Musk surprised everyone by announcing that SpaceX will attempt its first ever Starship catch on Flight 14. But is the vehicle actually ready for that? What makes catching the upper stage so much more difficult than catching the booster that SpaceX needs 13 test flights before even considering it? Well, let's answer all of those questions. Catching a giant ship coming back from space is hard, but hitting that subscribe button is surprisingly easy, and it could also let you know when a cool thing in the spaceflight world happens, so don't be shy about hitting it. Now let's get back to catching Starship. Okay, to begin, how hard would it be to catch the Starship upper stage? I mean, SpaceX has already caught the Super Heavy booster multiple times, so catching a shorter upper stage should not be that difficult, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, even though Starship is shorter than the booster, most engineers would probably tell you it's actually the harder vehicle to catch, and there are a few reasons why. First, let's talk about the catch points themselves. The booster was basically built around this idea. It has large, extremely robust hardpoints near the grid fin section that are specifically designed to take the enormous loads from the tower's chopsticks. On newer boosters, the grid fins themselves even double as part of the catch structure. Starship is a completely different story. Instead, it uses dedicated catch pins. Early versions carried test pins mainly to collect data, but an operational catch means those pins have to support the weight of the entire vehicle while it's being grabbed by the tower. And unlike the booster, those pins also have to survive one small inconvenience: coming back from orbit. That's because Starship doesn't just fall from a few hundred kilometers up. It slams into Earth's atmosphere at nearly 7.8 kilometers per second. The booster, by comparison, is only traveling around a couple of kilometers per second before it begins its return. It still moves incredibly fast, but it's nowhere near orbital velocity. That difference is absolutely massive. Even after atmospheric drag does most of the braking, Starship has to get rid of far more energy before it can even think about lining up with the tower. Depending on the exact masses, you're talking about roughly 10 to 20 times more kinetic energy than the booster has to deal with during recovery. That's like comparing dropping your phone onto the couch versus throwing it out of a moving car. They're both technically impacts, but one of them is going to ruin your day. And that leads to another challenge. The booster's catch happens after a relatively short trip. Starship's catch comes after an orbital mission, a deorbit burn, one of the hottest atmospheric reentries ever attempted by a reusable spacecraft, the belly flop maneuver, the landing flip, and finally a powered descent toward the tower. That's a lot of opportunities for something to go wrong. If the heat shield loses too many tiles, the wrong parts of the vehicle could overheat. If the attitude control is even slightly off during reentry, the landing solution changes. If the timing is off by just a little, the tower isn't grabbing anything except empty air. And unlike the booster, Starship also has another big requirement. Its Raptor engines have to relight reliably after spending a long time in space. Rockets aren't cars. You can't just leave them parked for an hour and expect them to start every single time without complaining. Everything inside the tanks is sloshing around. The propellants are changing temperature, pressures are shifting, and then, at the most critical moment of the entire mission, you ask the engines to fire perfectly. Starship also behaves differently because its mass distribution and center of gravity aren't the same as the boosters. Even if it's lighter at the catch, it responds differently to steering inputs, which means the guidance system has to solve a different problem during those final seconds. So when you put everything together, an upper stage catch isn't just a booster catch, but higher. It combines orbital reentry, extreme heating, long-duration spacecraft operations, engine relights, an incredibly precise landing, and a successful tower catch, all in one mission. Pulling that off would be one of the biggest milestones SpaceX has ever achieved on the road to full reusability. So, with all that, is Starship actually ready to be caught? Honestly, after Flight 13, it might be. The mission gave SpaceX a lot of confidence. Ship 40 reached orbit, survived re-entry, pulled off the landing flip, and then made a nice, soft landing in the ocean. That's basically the entire catch sequence, right up until the very last moment. Because the biggest difference between splashing into the ocean and getting caught by the tower is, well, what you're aiming at. Instead of targeting a giant body of water that's, let's be honest, pretty hard to miss, the ship has to fly itself into a very precise position next to the launch tower so the chopsticks can grab it. It's kind of like switching from parking in an empty parking lot to backing into the only open spot downtown during rush hour. The important part is that Flight 13 showed the guidance and navigation systems were incredibly accurate. The ship flew exactly where it was supposed to, all the way through landing. So from a flight control perspective, SpaceX has pretty much demonstrated everything they can without actually going for the catch. And it's not just the flight results giving them confidence. Starship version 3 also comes with a few hardware upgrades that really make this kind of mission a lot more practical. For example, the aft flaps now use a single actuator with 3 motors instead of 2 separate actuators. That gives the system more redundancy while also making it lighter and less complicated. It's one of those rare engineering changes where everyone somehow wins. Version 3 also has a much better reaction control system, upgraded valves, full vacuum insulation around the header feed system, a new electrically driven cryogenic recirculation system, and a dedicated setup for managing propellants around the engines during long coasts in space. That last part is especially important because a return to launch site mission is a completely different beast from the suborbital flights we've seen before. The ship spends much longer in orbit, follows a different trajectory, and then has to come all the way back to Starbase with everything still working perfectly. That's asking a lot more from the vehicle. But of course, catching Starship isn't just about the ship. You also need something that's actually going to catch it. And right now, that's Pad 2. It is currently the main and only launch pad that's been set up for catching the upper stage. The chopsticks are now shorter than the old pad, which lets them move faster and track the vehicle more precisely during catch operations. Their main actuators have also been switched from hydraulic to electromechanical systems, improving speed while adding more redundancy and reliability. Because Flight 13 went so well, a lot of people are already looking ahead to Flight 14. And honestly, the optimism makes sense. If post-flight inspections don't uncover anything major, there's a good chance the next launch could happen just a few weeks later. Really, there are only a few things that could slow SpaceX down. The first would be damage to the launch pad, or Stage 0. But so far, there hasn't been any sign of that. The pads seem to handle Flight 13 surprisingly well. The second would be if engineers find a serious issue while going through all the flight data and inspecting the hardware. Just because a mission looks smooth on the live stream doesn't mean the engineers aren't going to spend weeks looking for tiny problems. Rockets are kind of like your laptop after an update. It might seem fine at first, and then 3 days later you discover something weird that nobody noticed. And then there's the FAA. Normally, any major anomaly could trigger a formal mishap investigation, which would delay the next flight. But fortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case here. Flight 13 did have a couple of off-nominal moments, including an early engine shutdown during the boost back burn and a harder-than-planned booster splashdown. But according to reports, after reviewing the telemetry and flight data, the FAA determined there was no public injury, no property damage, and the events didn't meet the threshold for opening a formal mishap investigation. So that's definitely good news for Flight 14's timeline. Here's the question everyone's asking. Will Flight 14 finally catch both stages? Eventually, that's the goal. SpaceX wants both Super Heavy and Starship returning to the launch tower after every mission. Now the ship, I can actually see that happening. The booster, I'm not quite convinced yet. Flight 13 showed a lot of progress. The boost back burn worked, the descent looked solid, and the landing burn started right on schedule. But then, one of the Raptor engines failed to restart. The booster still made it down, but it hit the water harder than planned. That's a pretty clear sign that version 3 Super Heavy still hasn't fully proven its final landing sequence. So if I had to guess, Flight 14 will probably have the booster splash down again instead of risking a tower catch. Fix the engine restart issue first, then go for the catch later. That seems like the more SpaceX-like approach. Push the limits, just not all of them at once. And honestly, that might work out perfectly anyway. SpaceX has one active launch pad in Texas and a second Starship pad undergoing renovations there. 2 Starship launch sites are under construction at Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. So right now, SpaceX effectively has only one operational catch tower. Even if the booster was ready, there's still a practical question nobody outside the company really knows the answer to. Can the ship stay in orbit long enough for ground crews to secure the booster, clear the pad, and get everything ready for a second catch? Or will SpaceX need 2 fully operational towers before they can routinely catch both vehicles on the same mission? For now, we simply don't know. What we do know is that Flight 14 has the potential to be one of the most exciting Starship flights yet. Whether it's a ship catch, another booster recovery, or maybe both someday, the next launch is going to be one heck of a show. And honestly, I can't wait to watch it. If you're just as excited as I am, let me know by dropping "Let's catch that ship" down in the comments. Before we wrap up, there's one more thing that's worth talking about. And honestly, I think it's one of the most interesting discussions happening right now. After Flight 13, you can really see the conversation starting to change. A few months ago, everyone was asking, can SpaceX even catch Starship? Now the question is becoming, okay, how do they make this practical? Because catching one ship is cool. Catching hundreds of them every year is a completely different challenge. One idea that's been getting a lot of attention is building dedicated landing towers for Starship. The concept is pretty straightforward. Launch Pad 1 and Pad 2 would continue doing what they're designed for, launching rockets, while returning Starships would fly to separate towers built specifically for catching them. These towers wouldn't need launch mounts, fueling systems, or any of the complex infrastructure required to send a rocket into space. Their only job would be to catch returning vehicles. There are some obvious advantages to that approach. Your launch towers stay available instead of being occupied by a vehicle that just landed. Returning ships don't interfere with launch operations. And if flight rates continue increasing, SpaceX could simply add more landing towers without having to build entire launch pads. These landing-only towers would be much cheaper since they wouldn't need all the plumbing, propellant systems, and ground equipment that make a launch tower so expensive. It's a pretty sensible idea, but it doesn't really match Elon's long-term vision. Both Elon Musk and Gwynne Shotwell have repeatedly said that the ultimate goal is to relaunch a Starship roughly 1 hour after it lands. That's a completely different level of reusability. Instead of catching the vehicle, moving it somewhere else for inspection, and preparing it for another mission days later, the idea is to catch it, refill the propellant tanks, load a new payload, and send it back into space almost immediately. In other words, they want Starship to operate much more like an airliner than a traditional rocket. Of course, getting there is going to be incredibly difficult. For starters, the propellant system alone creates a long checklist after every landing. Methane naturally boils off over time, the oxygen system has to be purged, moisture can build up inside the tanks, and engineers still need to verify that everything is functioning correctly before refueling begins. None of those tasks are impossible, but together they take time. Then there's what is probably the biggest engineering question of all, the heat shield. Flight 13 looked fantastic from the outside, and version 3 clearly handled re-entry much better than previous vehicles. But one successful flight doesn't prove the system is ready for rapid reuse. Engineers will still want to inspect the tiles carefully to see whether any cracked during re-entry, whether the adhesive degraded under extreme temperatures, whether thermal cycling loosened anything, or whether hidden damage developed beneath the surface. Those are exactly the kinds of problems that only show up after careful inspections. History also gives SpaceX plenty of reasons to be cautious. The space shuttle relied on thermal protection tiles that demanded enormous amounts of inspection and maintenance after almost every mission, which became one of the biggest reasons turnaround times were measured in months rather than days. Even if SpaceX eventually manages to prepare the vehicle for another launch in just 1 hour, Starship usually can't return to Starbase 1 hour after liftoff in the first place. Once it's in orbit, the Earth keeps rotating underneath it, so the spacecraft often has to complete several more orbits before its ground track lines up with Starbase again. Depending on the mission, that could mean waiting 3 or 4 orbits before beginning the deorbit burn. So the timeline is really more like this: launch, spend several hours in orbit, return to Starbase, get caught by the tower, spend about an hour preparing the vehicle, and then launch again. That's an important distinction because when Elon talks about a 1-hour turnaround, he's talking about 1 hour after landing, not 1 hour after launch. Even so, if SpaceX can eventually make that a reality, it would completely change how we think about rockets. At that point, Starship wouldn't just be reusable, It would be operating in a way that's much closer to commercial aviation than anything the space industry has ever achieved. For the first time ever, after a Starship test flight, SpaceX's biggest question isn't, what did the telemetry tell us? It's, what do we do with the giant rocket floating in the middle of the ocean? I mean, seriously, what do they do? So before exploring how SpaceX will bring the ship back, how on earth did Starship survive slamming into the ocean in the first place? As Starship comes down for its landing burn, it lights all three of its Raptor engines. Right away, that's a noticeable change from Flight 12, which only ignited two. That might sound like a small tweak, but it actually makes a pretty big difference. On Flight 12, the ship was already starting to roll by the end of the landing burn before it splashed down. This time, SpaceX seems to have given the flight computer a lot more control during one of the trickiest parts of the flight. The result is pretty obvious in the footage. Unlike Flight 12, Starship stays upright almost all the way to the water. Only after touchdown does it begin to lean over, and even then it tips gradually instead of immediately flopping onto its side. Now, because Starship actually stays upright for a few moments after touchdown, it doesn't immediately flop over like a tree someone just cut down. Instead, it slowly begins to lean before eventually tipping into the water. That seemingly small detail tells us something interesting. The most likely explanation is that the aft end, the engine section, actually sank into the water before the rest of the vehicle tipped over. In other words, Starship didn't just smack the surface and bounce, it partially settled into the ocean first. Now, why does that matter? Imagine trying to push a floating bottle underwater in a swimming pool. At first, it barely moves because the water is constantly pushing back. The deeper you force the heavy end under, the more the surrounding water resists sudden motion. Starship was probably experiencing something similar. As the engine section submerged, the water itself provided buoyancy and hydrodynamic resistance that slowed the rotation. Instead of instantly falling over, the ship was almost being cradled by the ocean. There's another clue hiding in the landing footage. If you compare Flight 13 with earlier Starship tests, you'll notice the engines seem to stay lit much longer. Previous flights usually shut the Raptors down noticeably above the water, leaving the vehicle to coast the final stretch. Flight 13 looks different. Both the onboard camera and the drone footage suggest the engines kept firing almost right until splashdown. The shutdown happens incredibly close to the surface, leaving a massive exhaust plume blasting across the ocean. That's exactly what you'd expect if SpaceX was trying to squeeze every last bit of velocity out before touchdown. And those three Raptors weren't just slowing the ship down, they were dumping an enormous amount of hot gas into the water beneath it. That churns the ocean into a frothy mixture of water and bubbles instead of a solid wall of dense seawater. Think about belly flopping into a hot tub with the jets turned on versus diving into a perfectly still swimming pool. In theory, Starship may have first impacted this aerated, bubbly layer before reaching denser water underneath, slightly softening the initial impact. Now, we can't say for certain how much difference that made, but combined with the extremely low touchdown speed and the controlled landing profile, it's another reasonable explanation for why Starship walked away from a splashdown that looked like it should have ended much worse. SpaceX almost certainly wanted the softest splashdown possible. That's obvious from the landing profile. They also would have loved to inspect an intact Starship if one happened to survive. Once Ship 40 kept floating, and kept transmitting telemetry, and then kept floating some more, recovering it started making a lot more sense. And honestly, can you blame them? This is the first Starship to survive re-entry with its heat shield largely intact. Every extra hour it stays afloat is another chance to gather data that no computer simulation can provide. One thing that's actually impressed me throughout all of this is how well SpaceX seems to be improvising. A lot of people have been asking the same question. Why has the recovery taken so long? At first glance, it does seem a little strange. The ship survives, everyone gets excited, and then nothing much happens for a couple of days. But the delay isn't necessarily because SpaceX couldn't find ships. That's only part of the story. The bigger challenge may have been getting the right people to the right place. Think about it. This isn't like calling a tow truck because your car broke down outside Walmart. The engineers who understand Starship's structure are based in Texas. They have to fly halfway around the world to Western Australia before they can even board the recovery vessels. Once they're on site, they need to inspect the vehicle and decide something surprisingly important. Where can you actually pick this thing up? Starship may have survived, but it's still a giant stainless steel cylinder that wasn't exactly designed to be lifted out of the ocean by a crane. The engineers know where the structure can safely handle the loads, which parts might have been weakened during re-entry, and which sections absolutely shouldn't have a giant cable wrapped around them. They're also the people who know exactly what data is worth collecting. Which heat shield tiles should be removed? Which gap fillers deserve a closer look? Which areas experience the highest heating during re-entry? Those aren't decisions you leave to the nearest tugboat captain. So when you consider international travel, organizing specialized crews, and the fact that the splashdown happened more than 1,000 kilometers off the Australian coast, waiting a few days really isn't that surprising. Even if SpaceX ultimately decides not to tow the entire vehicle back to shore, simply getting engineers alongside the ship to inspect the tiles, collect samples, and document its condition would be incredibly valuable. Because in rocket development, hardware is king. You can stare at telemetry plots all day long, but nothing beats walking up to the actual vehicle, pointing at a tile and saying, "Huh, well that wasn't in the simulation." And somehow, against all odds, Flight 13 has given SpaceX exactly that opportunity. Now, another interesting question after Flight 13 splashdown is, was SpaceX actually simulating a tower catch? People quickly noticed that Flight 12 and Flight 13 splashed down in almost exactly the same location. The big difference is that Flight 13 flew a much cleaner final approach, with all 3 Raptor engines igniting for the landing burn. That alone got people wondering if SpaceX was practicing the same guidance profile it would use for an actual catch. Then, Elon Musk added even more fuel to the speculation by posting on X that the ship landing was precise, meaning that it would have been caught by the tower arms. That certainly makes it sound like Flight 13 wasn't just aiming for the ocean, it was aiming for the same level of precision needed to fly straight into the launch tower. Does that mean Flight 14 will actually attempt a catch? It's looking more likely than ever. The overall result of Flight 13 is undeniably encouraging. Whatever those white streaks represent, the vehicle completed an orbital re-entry, retained nearly all of its tiles, executed a controlled landing burn, splashed down intact, and remained afloat for days. That's a much stronger demonstration of TPS performance than earlier flights, even if it doesn't yet prove rapid reusability. Today, spaceflight is facing a huge problem. Every spacecraft carries a limited amount of propellant, and once it's gone, that's usually the end of the mission. Whether it's exploring deeper into space, changing orbits, or simply staying operational longer, everything is ultimately limited by one thing: fuel. That's why so many future missions, from sending astronauts to Mars to building orbital fuel depots to operating massive next-generation satellites, will eventually depend on one capability: transferring large amounts of propellant while already in space. And yet, despite how important that technology could become, investment in orbital refueling is still surprisingly small. It's almost as if everyone agrees it's important, but nobody wants to be the first to write the really big check. Well, almost nobody. SpaceX is doing the exact opposite. Their biggest gamble right now is the giant spacecraft named Starship, and a huge part of its future depends on mastering orbital refueling. Even more exciting, the company is aiming to prove it can actually pull it off this year. So, how exactly are they going to do it? How can they overcome all the challenges of the past and do something that's never been done before? Transfer fuel between 2 giant spacecraft in space. Now, in-orbit refueling isn't exactly a brand new idea. We've actually been doing versions of it for decades. Space stations like Salyut 6, Mir, and even the International Space Station have all received regular deliveries of fuel over the years. So the concept itself isn't some crazy sci-fi fantasy anymore. The problem is, it's still a huge pain. Every refueling mission costs a lot of money, requires incredibly careful planning, and leaves almost no room for mistakes. Accidentally spilling fuel in your garage is annoying. Accidentally spilling rocket propellant while both spacecraft are flying around Earth at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour? Yeah, that's a slightly bigger issue. So what actually has to happen to make in-orbit refueling work? There are really 3 big challenges. The first is the spacecraft themselves. Before you can even think about moving fuel, 2 spacecraft have to find each other in an ocean of empty space, slowly close the distance, dock without turning themselves into an expensive fireworks show, and then transfer cryogenic propellant without leaks. That means you need standardized fuel connections, autonomous docking systems, and navigation that's ridiculously accurate. We're talking about two vehicles moving at orbital speed while trying to line up with centimeter-level precision. The second challenge is orbital mechanics. Contrary to what movies sometimes make it look like, spacecraft aren't just floating around waiting for each other. Everything in orbit is constantly moving, and changing even a tiny part of your orbit costs fuel, what engineers call delta V. So mission planners have to carefully figure out where fuel depots should be placed, how servicing spacecraft get there, and exactly when the rendezvous should happen. Because if you're even a little late, your meeting point has already flown hundreds of kilometers away. Space is surprisingly good at making simple appointments incredibly complicated. And then there's the third challenge, one that sounds simple until physics decides to ruin everyone's day. How do you actually move liquid fuel around when there's no gravity? Here on Earth, gravity conveniently keeps liquids sitting at the bottom of a tank. In space, gravity basically clocks out of work. Scientists spent years trying to understand this. Many of the earliest experiments were performed in drop towers, where researchers literally dropped equipment from very tall towers to create a few precious seconds of weightlessness. Not exactly the most convenient laboratory, but hey, you work with what you've got. Those experiments quickly revealed a problem. Without gravity, the fuel doesn't stay near the outlet of the tank. Instead, it floats around randomly while gas bubbles mix into the liquid. That means the outlet can start sucking in gas long before the tank is actually empty, sometimes when there's still nearly a third of the fuel left inside. Needless to say, rocket engines are not big fans of drinking air. To solve this, engineers invented something called propellant management devices, or PMDs. Their entire job is surprisingly straightforward. Keep the liquid where you want it, and keep the gas somewhere else. One common design is called a screen channel PMD. It uses an incredibly fine metal mesh. The tiny openings allow liquid fuel to pass through, while surface tension prevents gas bubbles from following. You can almost think of it like an extremely high-tech coffee filter. The liquid sticks to the screen, but the gas stays on the other side until the pressure gets too high. Multiple channels are placed around the tank so that at least one of them is always in contact with the fuel, regardless of how the liquid decides to float around. A great example is that NASA used this approach in the Space Shuttle's reaction control system. The second design is known as a vane PMD. Instead of fine screens, it uses thin metal plates called vanes. Thanks to surface tension, the vanes naturally guide the liquid toward the outlet without needing any moving parts. They're lighter, cheaper, and can continue working even if a few small gas bubbles find their way into the fuel. There's just one tiny catch. They only work properly in actual weightlessness, which means you can't fully test them on Earth. Engineers basically have to say, well, the math says this should work, and then wait until the spacecraft gets to space to find out if the math was having a good day. Thankfully, it usually is. The Viking orbiter successfully used this type of system decades ago. Some spacecraft even combine both ideas. The vanes first gather the fuel near the outlet, while the screen acts as one final checkpoint to make sure only liquid reaches the plumbing. It's basically teamwork, but for pieces of metal inside a fuel tank. Of course, there's another way to avoid many of these problems altogether. Instead of letting fuel float freely inside the tank, why not stop it from floating in the first place? That's exactly the solution Russia came up with for its Progress spacecraft. Since 1978, the Soviet Union, and later Russia, has refueled space stations routinely using Progress vehicles, supporting Salyut 6, Mir, and eventually the International Space Station. Their tanks contain a flexible membrane, or bladder, that separates the fuel from the pressurized nitrogen gas. As the nitrogen pushes on the bladder, it squeezes the fuel out just like toothpaste coming out of a tube. Since the gas never actually touches the propellant, it can't accidentally get pumped into the transfer lines. The fuel and oxidizer are also transferred separately, reducing the risk if a leak ever occurs. It might not be the flashiest engineering solution ever invented, but after nearly 5 decades of successful missions, it's pretty hard to argue with the results. Now you know how we've been transferring fuel in space for decades. But then Starship came along and basically said, what if we made this problem way harder? The biggest reason is the type of propellant it uses. Unlike spacecraft that run on storable fuels like hydrazine, Starship burns liquid methane and liquid oxygen. These are cryogenic propellants, meaning they have to stay ridiculously cold to remain liquid. And cryogenic fuels are, well, kind of drama queens. They constantly absorb heat from their surroundings, boil very easily, create gas as they warm up, and because they're much less dense than traditional propellants, you need much larger tanks to store enough of them. All of that turns what was already a difficult refueling operation into something significantly more complicated. Naturally, you might wonder why SpaceX doesn't just borrow the Russian approach and use flexible bladders inside the tanks. Unfortunately, physics has other ideas. Rubber membranes become brittle at cryogenic temperatures and can simply crack apart. Thin metal membranes survive a little longer, but after being cooled down and warmed up over and over again, they eventually develop fatigue cracks as well. So engineers had to start looking for completely different solutions. One idea was to store the propellant above its critical pressure. At that point, there's no clear boundary between a liquid and a gas. Instead, the propellant becomes what's known as a supercritical fluid, making it much easier to manage because you don't have to worry about liquids sloshing around or gas bubbles forming inside the tank. NASA actually used this technique to supply hydrogen and oxygen to the space shuttle's fuel cells, so the concept definitely works. The problem is scale. Building tanks strong enough to safely hold hundreds or even thousands of tons of propellant at those kinds of pressures would make them incredibly heavy. And in rocketry, adding weight is basically the engineering equivalent of voluntarily running a marathon while carrying a refrigerator. So while the idea is clever, it just doesn't make much sense for something as massive as Starship. Instead, researchers found a much more practical solution called no-vent fill. Normally, when you pump cryogenic propellant into a warmer tank, some of it immediately boils into gas. The traditional solution is pretty simple. Open a vent and let that gas escape into space. The downside is you're literally throwing away fuel. No vent fill takes a smarter approach. Instead of venting the gas, the incoming propellant is cooled to an even lower temperature than normal. As this extra cold fuel enters the tank, it absorbs heat from both the warm tank walls and the gas inside. That gas then cools down enough to condense back into liquid. In other words, instead of watching your propellant disappear out of vent, you recycle most of it right back into usable fuel. Before the main transfer begins, engineers still sacrifice a small amount of propellant to chill the tank and purge any unwanted gases. Think of it like letting the cold water run for a few seconds before taking a shower. It feels a little wasteful, but it makes everything work much better afterward. And then there are the problems that only show up when your spacecraft is the size of a small skyscraper. Most spacecraft only need a few tons of propellant. Starship? It needs thousands. According to a NASA Office of Inspector General report, a single lunar mission could require roughly 15 tanker launches just to deliver enough propellant to an orbital fuel depot for one Starship. That's not one launch. That's an entire launch campaign before the real mission even begins. And getting all that fuel into orbit is only half the battle. Once it's there, someone has to keep it cold. That's an engineering challenge nobody has ever attempted on this scale. Then there's the logistics. NASA estimates SpaceX will likely need an average launch cadence of about one mission every 8 days to support this kind of operation. Now, that might sound completely insane until you remember we're talking about SpaceX. This is the same company that looked at reusable rockets, something many people thought would never be practical, and somehow turned it into their normal Tuesday. To reach that kind of flight rate, SpaceX is rapidly expanding its launch infrastructure. Starbase continues to gain new pads and upgraded facilities, while in Florida, the company is preparing additional Starship launch sites, including the former SLC-37 complex. Altogether, the long-term goal is dozens upon dozens of Starship launches every year. But perhaps the biggest improvement won't come from launching more tankers. It'll come from needing fewer of them in the first place. The planning Starship version 4 is expected to carry around 2,300 tons of propellant, significantly more than today's vehicles. If those performance targets are achieved, the number of tanker flights needed for a lunar mission could drop from around 15 to just 5 or 6. That's still a lot of launches, but it's a whole lot less crazy than 15. And perhaps the best news for SpaceX is that they have something every engineer secretly wishes for: more time. The Artemis schedule has shifted over the past few years, with the first crewed lunar landing now expected during Artemis 4 in 2028 instead of Artemis 3. That gives SpaceX a larger window to prove that Starship can repeatedly reach orbit, deploy payloads, survive long-duration missions, and, most importantly, demonstrate reliable cryogenic fuel transfer in space. After hearing all of that, it's probably easy to understand why so many people look at in-orbit refueling and say, yeah, that's never going to work. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong. This is an incredibly difficult problem. It'll take years of testing, plenty of failures, and a whole lot of engineering headaches before anyone truly masters it. But here's the thing. Some challenges aren't optional. If humanity wants to go beyond low Earth orbit on a regular basis, to build bases on the Moon, send people to Mars, or explore even farther, we eventually have to figure this out. In many ways, orbital refueling is less of a nice bonus and more of a missing piece of the puzzle. That's exactly why NASA and many commercial space companies are investing so much time and money into it. One day, spacecraft might not need all of their fuel to come from Earth. Instead, water ice mined from the Moon could be split into hydrogen and oxygen to create rocket propellant right there in space. If engineers can reliably store and transfer these super cold liquids, whether they're launched from Earth or produced somewhere else, suddenly permanent lunar bases become much more practical, and missions to Mars become far more realistic. And the possibilities don't stop there. Once you can refuel spacecraft in orbit, entirely new industries start to appear. You could have orbital fuel depots, companies whose entire business is delivering propellant, supply stations around the Moon, cargo routes between Earth and lunar orbit, and eventually even logistics networks stretching all the way to Mars. Think about how airplanes work today. A passenger jet doesn't carry enough fuel to fly everywhere it might ever need to go. It lands, refuels, and continues its journey. Spacecraft could eventually do exactly the same thing. Instead of launching with absolutely everything they'll ever need, they could stop along the way, top off their tanks, and keep going. It's a simple idea, but it completely changes what's possible. There's another reason this technology matters too. Space isn't just becoming more important for exploration, it's becoming more important for the global economy, scientific research, and national security as well. Right now, every satellite has one major limitation. Once it runs out of fuel, its useful life is basically over. But if satellites could be refueled in orbit, they could stay operational for much longer, maneuver more freely, and even be upgraded instead of replaced. That could make future satellite networks more capable, more resilient, and significantly cheaper to maintain. In a way, we're standing at another turning point in the history of spaceflight. Back in 1957, Sputnik proved that the space age had truly begun, changing the course of technology and geopolitics for decades. Today, in-orbit refueling could become one of those breakthroughs that quietly changes everything. It won't make as many headlines as a giant rocket launch. It probably won't go viral on social media. But if we ever build a future where spacecraft routinely travel between Earth, the Moon, and Mars, there's a good chance it won't be because we built bigger rockets. It'll be because we finally figured out how to fill up the tank along the way.
So I shared where the hardware is, but let me talk a little bit more about what we expect Artemis 3 to look like.
What exactly is going on with Artemis 3? NASA recently revealed a lot of new details about Artemis 3, including the crew, the mission profile, who will be on board, and perhaps most importantly, the lunar landers that will support the program. And honestly, the update left me a little disappointed. From what we've learned so far, it appears that both HLS providers may be showing up with versions of their landers that aren't fully ready. SpaceX, for example, is reportedly planning to fly what is essentially a fairly standard Starship V3 rather than a fully mature human landing system. So what's going on here? Why would NASA's flagship moon mission potentially fly with landers that aren't completely finished? If you've been following NASA's moon program lately, you may have noticed a recurring pattern. Every few months, it seems like someone walks into a conference room, stares at the mission architecture for a few minutes, sighs dramatically, and then redraws half of it with a different colored marker. As a result, Artemis 3 will no longer be the mission that finally returns astronauts to the lunar surface. Instead, NASA uses it primarily as a giant dress rehearsal in Earth orbit. Under the proposed plan, NASA astronauts would rendezvous with Blue Origin's lunar lander in low Earth orbit. They would dock with the vehicle, transfer between spacecraft test life support systems, practice operational procedures, and even rehearse tasks such as putting on lunar spacesuits in microgravity. None of that sounds as exciting as planting flags on the moon, but it's exactly the kind of work that becomes critically important when your crew is hundreds of thousands of kilometers from home. For NASA, the top priority of this mission would be proving out the lunar lander itself. And to be honest, that's probably the agency's biggest concern right now. Before sending astronauts all the way to the moon aboard a brand new landing system, NASA wants to make sure the vehicle can do everything it's supposed to do in a real operational environment. As I mentioned earlier, the most surprising part of the entire reveal this time was the lunar landers. Both Blue Origin and SpaceX have shared updates on their roles in Artemis 3 and Artemis 4. And hidden among all those presentation slides was a pretty important detail about the human landing systems that will be flying those missions. The first update came from Blue Origin, and before talking about lunar landers, they had to address the elephant-sized crater in the room. Back on May 28th, Blue Origin suffered a major launch pad accident at Launch Complex 36A. Not exactly the kind of thing you want happening when you're trying to convince NASA that you're ready to help build the future of lunar exploration. But, according to the company, cleanup efforts are progressing. The investigation is moving forward, and work is continuing at a separate facility, Launch Complex 36B. In other words, development hasn't stopped. Okay, that's really great to hear. Now, what exactly is Blue Origin bringing to Artemis 3? The spacecraft NASA plans to use is called the Mark II Lunar Crew Module, which is currently under construction. Blue Origin is also building its earlier Mark I landers for technology demonstrations and future lunar infrastructure plans, but the vehicle assigned to Artemis 3 is specifically the more advanced Mark II. The spacecraft will include many of the systems that future moon missions will rely on. That includes Blue Origin's BE-7 engine, the same engine family designed for lunar landings, along with a storable reaction control system that allows the vehicle to maneuver and maintain its orientation in space. It will also carry a full docking system, which is kind of important considering the entire mission revolves around meeting up with Orion in Earth orbit without accidentally turning a carefully planned rendezvous into the world's most expensive parking lot incident. Perhaps even more important is the Environmental Control and Life Support System, or ECLSS. In simple terms, that's the hardware responsible for keeping astronauts alive. Air temperature control, pressure management, all the stuff humans tend to be surprisingly attached to. Artemis 3 will be the first opportunity to test many of these systems in space with a crew on board. Blue Origin has even built a training version of the crew cabin on the ground, allowing astronauts to start practicing mission procedures long before the actual spacecraft leaves Earth. The spacecraft is also designed to remain in orbit for up to 90 days if necessary. That gives NASA plenty of scheduling flexibility and allows the lander to wait for Orion's arrival rather than forcing every launch to happen within a narrow time window. Once Orion docks with the vehicle, astronauts are expected to spend roughly 2 days aboard. During that time, they'll test spacecraft controls, move between vehicles, evaluate life support systems, and even practice tasks like putting on lunar spacesuits in zero gravity. Even though Blue Origin just suffered a major setback with its launch pad accident, the company seems to be recovering surprisingly quickly. Ironically, the bigger source of debate right now isn't Blue Origin at all. It's SpaceX. When SpaceX revealed what it plans to fly for Artemis 3, a lot of people immediately started raising their eyebrows. For Artemis 3, SpaceX won't be bringing a fully operational human landing system to orbit. Instead, the company plans to launch what is essentially a Starship HLS Pathfinder, a test vehicle designed primarily to validate docking and proximity operations rather than perform an actual lunar mission. And that's where the controversy starts. On paper, this Artemis 3 Starship sounds much closer to a standard version 3 Starship than the moon lander many people expected to see. The vehicle will carry a docking system compatible with Orion, using the same international docking system standard that SpaceX already uses on Dragon spacecraft. It will also include navigation sensors, rendezvous equipment, avionics, power systems, and flight control hardware needed to safely approach and dock with Orion in Earth orbit. But beyond that, many of the features people normally associate with the Starship human landing system simply won't be there. There won't be a fully operational crew habitat for astronauts to live in. There won't be the large, lunar-optimized crew areas expected on the final moon lander. There won't be an elevator needed to lower astronauts from Starship's towering height down to the lunar surface. And there won't be all the specialized systems required for a complete mission to the moon and back. In fact, astronauts aren't even expected to enter the Starship during these tests. Unlike Blue Origin's lander, where crews are expected to cross over and spend time inside the vehicle, the SpaceX Pathfinder will remain uncrewed throughout the mission. Its job is much simpler. Launch into low Earth orbit, meet up with Orion, dock successfully, collect data, go home. That's it. Because many people heard that description and asked a pretty reasonable question. Wait, if this is basically just a normal Starship with a docking port attached, what exactly are we testing? It's not a crazy criticism. After all, when most people hear human landing system, they imagine something that actually resembles a lunar lander. They picture life support systems, crew quarters, lunar landing engines, surface operations equipment, and all the hardware needed to put astronauts on the moon. Instead, Artemis 3 appears to be getting something far more limited. It almost feels like showing up to a driving test with a car that's missing half the parts you're eventually planning to use. Luckily for us, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman has already addressed that exact question. In a lengthy post on X, he asked, "What are the objectives for Artemis 3 if both landers are not fully ready yet?" After a highly successful Artemis 2 mission, it's no surprise that expectations for Artemis 3 are sky high. But what Isaacman is essentially saying is this: stop thinking of Artemis 3 as the moon landing mission. Start thinking of it as the mission that makes the moon landing possible. During Apollo, NASA designed and managed almost everything itself. Today, the situation is a lot more complicated. You've got NASA hardware, SpaceX hardware, Blue Origin hardware, different software systems, different engineering teams, different operating procedures, and even different mission control centers. It's kind of like trying to build a Formula One car where the engine comes from one company, the transmission comes from another, the steering system comes from a third, and everyone insists their part is definitely not the problem. At some point, you have to bolt everything together and see what happens. That's what Artemis 3 is increasingly becoming. And that's also why Isaacman specifically says the landers don't need to be fully certified lunar landers yet. NASA is no longer trying to test every capability all at once. Instead, the agency wants to focus on specific systems. Can astronauts dock with the vehicles? Can crews safely transfer between spacecraft? Do the life support systems perform as expected? Can all the software systems communicate properly? Can the spacecraft be controlled the way engineers expect? Those are all critical questions, even if nobody actually lands on the moon during the mission. For Blue Origin, this is especially important because its lander still contains a significant amount of hardware that has never operated in space before. The biggest examples are the crew cabin and life support systems. Those systems need real-world testing. You can run simulations forever, but eventually you need actual astronauts sitting inside the spacecraft to see how everything behaves. Space has a nasty habit of finding problems that engineers never even considered. As for SpaceX, Isaacman suggests the situation is a bit different. NASA already has years of experience flying astronauts aboard Crew Dragon, so the agency is far less concerned about things like life support docking or crew transportation. Those capabilities have been demonstrated again and again. Instead, NASA is interested in testing other aspects of Starship. One particularly interesting example he mentioned is controllability during the translunar injection burn, the massive engine burn that sends a spacecraft from Earth toward the Moon. Under the proposed architecture, Starship could actually be pushing Orion toward the Moon while the two spacecraft remain docked together. That creates an entirely new set of flight dynamics that nobody has ever tested before. Think of it like towing a trailer for the first time. Driving the truck itself isn't the hard part. Driving the truck while it's attached to something large, heavy, and incredibly expensive is where things start to get interesting. NASA wants to understand exactly how that combined spacecraft behaves long before astronauts are relying on it during an actual lunar mission. SpaceX is still pushing as hard as possible to develop the vehicle that would eventually carry astronauts to the Moon. According to Jessica Jensen, SpaceX's Vice President of Customer Operations and Integration, the company plans to attempt a Starship-to-Starship propellant transfer demonstration in orbit later this year. This is one of those milestones that sounds a bit boring until you realize that the entire Starship lunar architecture basically depends on it. A lunar Starship requires an enormous amount of propellant. So much, in fact, that launching it fully fueled from Earth simply isn't practical. Instead, the current plan calls for multiple tanker Starships to launch transfer fuel in orbit and gradually fill up a waiting lunar vehicle before it begins its journey to the Moon. If orbital refueling doesn't work, a huge part of SpaceX's current Moon strategy falls apart. At the same time, SpaceX is also making progress on the hardware that will actually support astronauts during lunar missions. We are actively building our first flight fidelity Starship HLS cabin at Starbase, Jensen said. The primary structure has been assembled and is now being prepared for installation of key functional systems, including avionics, power systems, life support equipment, and more over the coming months. In other words, while the full lunar lander may still be a work in progress, SpaceX is steadily checking off the major milestones needed to turn Starship from a giant rocket into a spacecraft capable of supporting